Welcome everybody to the final Tree Rings webinar as part of the Urban Tree Festival this week. We have a fantastic panel lined up for you this afternoon to discuss great trees. We're going to wait for more people to join us. A few more seconds. We have people streaming into the webinar, which is fantastic. We're expecting around about 100 attendees. So. We're going to have a good, lively discussion, I think, this afternoon. I'm Neil Sinden. I'm Director of CPRE London, the Countryside Charity, the London branch of the Countryside Charity, CPRE, which has a national network. And in London, we're working for a greener city and to bring London's countryside closer to people, both physically, but also intellectually and in terms of understanding and appreciation. So it's great to be involved in the Urban Tree Festival. Trees are, of course, an incredibly important part of our countryside, but also of our towns and cities. So that's all from me. If you've enjoyed other sessions in the Urban Tree Festival, we're encouraging all of you who've joined in to consider donating to the festival, which is run almost entirely on voluntary effort. So please, if you haven't already donated, we'd encourage you to do so. That's all from me. I'm going to hand over to Paul Wood, who will be chairing this afternoon's session. Over to you, Paul.
Great, thank you, Neil, and welcome everybody. We're going to have a fantastic discussion this afternoon, I'm sure. We've got three really interesting panelists. First up will be Simon Edwards, who many of you may know from his TiCL application and his high Twitter profile as TiCL Me. Simon's application and work is around mapping all sorts of things, but trees in particular, and great trees feature on his application. After Simon, we have Peter Fiennes, and Peter Fiennes in a previous life commissioned a book, The Great Trees of London, for Time Out, which was about 10 years ago, or possibly older. I'm sure Peter will put me right on that shortly. And that was a book which was a sort of watershed in terms of people's understanding of what the great trees of London were. We want to focus on trees outside London in this discussion as well. And I'm very pleased that we have Margaret Peart joining us from Sheffield. And Margaret is a great tree herself, tweets as Vernon Oak. Many of you may have come across her Twitter account, and was instrumental in setting up the Sheffield Street Tree Festival, and has been involved in a lot of the campaigns there, which I'm sure she'll be able to touch on in her presentation. I'm going to share my screen with you. And we're going to take you through some slides from all the contributors. I just wanted to mention one thing which I've done recently, which is I wrote and edited this Great Trees of London map, which is a bit of an update on the trees which were in the Time Out guide and the list which has been circulating for some years. It includes 46 trees, some of which are old, some of which are new. The tree behind me, you'll notice, is a almond tree, which is in Finsbury Park, close to where I live. And you can see it has a very twisted trunk, and it's quite a remarkable tree that is a local landmark. So I put this up as my contribution to great trees. So without me whittering on any longer, I'm going to hand over to Simon, who will take us from here. Simon.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very excited to be talking about great trees in the Urban Festival today. I'm going to start with my most boring slide and my most wordy, which are just going to be a series of questions and perhaps to think about answers to as I talk. So which are the great trees? Where are the great trees? And what makes a great tree? If we go to the next slide, I'll introduce why and how I got into trees to some extent. Look, it was two things, a publication by the Tree Council in 2002 of Great British Trees. It's easy to identify trees when there are plaques that tell you they're great. And in 2002, the Tree Council put rated 50 trees as great around the country, which was, I think, the first time great is mentioned in connection with trees. And I think this is a fantastic thing, as the Time Out book And I'm really so proud and pleased to be presenting with Peter Fiennes today, who commissioned that book, The Great Trees of London, and putting more plaques, another 56, just around great trees in London. And it was these two things that really got me excited about trees. And I'll explain why. And it's about the visiting of great trees that's the key. To really appreciate a tree, I think you've got to visit it, and that's what it's all about. So I'd like to go on to the next slide, which is, now, interestingly, some people will see here a small child in front of a tree, and other people will see a small child in front of a yew tree. But I know there are many out there who will be only seeing something getting in the way of one of the greatest trees of Britain, okay? And we'll recognise it as the Ankerwick yew. And this is where, for me, greatness, it suddenly dawned how great, how important great trees were. This is the site where supposedly King John sealed Magna Carta. And I urge you to take any child to see this tree, go to this tree and celebrate this tree. It's about our liberty. It's possibly one of the most important stories in Britain, and it's an absolutely spine-tingling tree to visit. It's an absolute cracker. Its girth is enormous. It's wonderful, and standing under it, you can tell the story of Magna Carta, but you can also practically feel King John's sweat as they held him to account, sealing this historic document. So I urge you to go and see that. It was in the Great British Trees book by the Tree Council, a fabulous tree. The next tree I wanted to point out was, now look, this is a wonderful tree. This is Barney, the Barn Elms plane, probably the oldest plane tree in London, and possibly the oldest plane tree in Britain. It is a magnificent tree. Only I could make this tree, I'm afraid, look small. Okay, it's a whopping great tree. And it's magnificent, and you only really do it justice by going to see it. I urge you to go and see it. It's a fabulous tree. It's got 4 huge branches that go off from this trunk, and they're all chained together at the top to stop the whole thing falling apart. And that gives the impression of sort of a monster, King Kong, just before he escapes. And it's a wonderful tree to go and see, and there's a plaque by it. Okay, and the thing that touched me about this was, it turned out, I only discovered this in my 20s, and it turns out it's 3 miles from where I was born and where I'd lived, and I'd never known about it. And what on earth, how could something like that have been hidden from me for 20 years? This is a most magnificent thing. And, you know, we go to cities, we routinely visit historic monuments. Why not the natural monuments, okay? These are natural cathedrals, and they connect people with nature, and there's that local pride, and it would encourage walking. Why isn't every city presenting great trees of London, or great trees of their own city? If we go to the next slide. So I determined to do something about it. I thought I would try and ask people where their great trees were, okay? And who could I ask? Now, I'm going to embarrass myself by leaving people out of this slide because I've got too many people to thank. But social media is a fantastic way of learning about trees, okay? And I show you there the 4 best bits of social media. The Sheffield Tree Festival has some real experts in it: Greg Packman, Pete Fiennes, Paul Wood, Pete Coles, all fantastic. Thanks to Pete Coles, a lot more mulberries have become great trees since joining. I've got to thank the London Tree Officers Association, who gave me their nominations for the 12 best trees in each borough of London. Fantastic. The Tree of the Year, the Woodland Trust competition. They have a Tree of the Year competition, and they work with us to show some of the great trees there. John Parker of the Arb Association, he's created, I hope you've been following us on Twitter, the Great Trees of Gloucester. Okay, only local people know about these fabulous trees. There's no way of looking them up. You've just got to ask people. You've got to try and find them, and we've got to try and share this to get people excited about trees. Vivian Barton there at the bottom has recently done a Great Trees of Brighton for us and shown us some fantastic trees. Rob Treehunter McBride first really got me excited. In fact, he was the one who first pointed me out the Anchorwick Yew and recommended me go and see it. And of course, Sheffield, who through their campaigning to save trees, pointed out some absolute crackers like Vernon Oak, who I'm absolutely thrilled we'll be hearing from in a minute, and Margaret Peart, obviously, and the fantastic elm tree. Next slide. I've also, a way of capturing great trees, I will have a little plug for my own app, but also to acknowledge when people create tree trails locally, they show me great trees, show us great trees. It's amazing how many great trees are sort of tucked away in estates and are absolutely fabulous to visit and worth the trip. And I'm so pleased people have been using this. And I'll mention Steve Middleton, National Federation of Parks and Green Spaces, and Tree Council for helping promote that. So next slide. These contributions to the app have created fabulous maps of Britain's great trees, London's great trees, all being updated all the time as more information comes in. The great trees of Brighton, the great trees of Gloucester, and more. There are more all over Sheffield, loads of places. Something interesting though, next slide, the opportunity, TiCL presents everything in a list simply with the nearest thing to you. So that when you're in London, and you open up the Great Trees of London, you see the opportunity there. So I'm in Fulham now, and the top of that list is Fulham Palace Home Oak, which is my nearest, the tree nearest I could go and see. That's great. Fabulous 500-year-old oak, home oak, well worth going to see. And I think I created this because this is what I needed. I would have needed to when I was younger and would have loved to have seen. Also, I'm going to say, clicking on these things, when people visit these trees, they click on them, we can measure those visits. We can measure good positive comments that people make on the app. And visiting and having pleasurable, having a pleasurable experience is potentially a way of measuring greatness. And I wonder what you think about that. Could we actually measure greatness with those? And I'll show you something that with the next slide that shows this. This was a trail that was created by Kensington and Chelsea tree officers. It included this tree eating her pillar box, okay? And more than any other tree on that trail, it was clicked on, and it was questions were asked about it, and it was visited more than any other. And I can show that that's the case. And that has elevated it. We elevated that tree because of that to Great Tree of London status, just because of the interest it had generated. And if we go to the next slide, The same happened to this tree, which is extraordinary, an extraordinary tree. It was on the St James's Park tree trail, and I know Greg Packman did a talk on a tree trail around St James's Park, but this was on our tree trail, and I used to tweet about this tree because I thought it was so extraordinary. I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a what the and every time I tweeted that, people would ask about it and would be interested in it. And after I tweeted, I would be able to see that people had gone to see the tree. They would ask where it was, and I would say you can find it with the app, and it's on the trail. And people would go and see it, and they left comments like, "I see a tree that's struggling to survive, a brave and fighting tree." And what would have caused that? They were just sort of interested in it. And the fact that I'd made people, in a way, change their behavior to make them go and see the tree, and that they were making these comments, elevated it to great tree status. And when you see a twisted old sort of a crumpled tree like that, that sort of made me rethink my ideas of great. And I'd be very interested in your thoughts on that. So I guess my end point is that answering the question, I've answered the questions as to what they are and also where they are. But I guess the end point is that my answer to what makes a tree great is you. It's your interest, it's your comments, it's your visits to these trees that make them great. And I'm trying to encourage and capture that. Thank you very much. I've absolutely no idea at the time. So keeping to time.
Thank you, Simon. That was really interesting. Just one question. What's the tree in the twisted tree in St James's Park? Is it a medlar?
Well, it was a medlar, Paul. It was a medlar. And I'm afraid it's no longer there. It died.
Okay, great.
Not through people visiting, I think, but
right, just a question about that. But
it's a medlar.
Yeah, thank you. So on to Peter, and I'll hand over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. I was here on the first Tree Rings webinar 8 or 9 days ago. It seems a blur, of the Urban Tree Festival, when I imposed poetry on people, and I'm starting again with some poetry, but I'm not going to be reading it this time. You'll be pleased to hear. But it's a lovely thought. Yes, what I thought I'd do instead is, if you don't mind, give you a little bit of history around what the great trees were, how it all started, and then bring it bang up to date. And thank you, Simon, for those very kind words. So can I have a slide, Paul? Yes, back in 2010, I was running Time Out's guides. And Time Out, of course, is in London, but it's around the world. An extremely urban brand, a city brand. We had city guides to around the world, as you can see. And we had loads of London guides as well, eating guides, pubs guides, but there was nothing on nature, and there was nothing, you can see it lurking. This is my subconscious, this tree. I've had a lifelong obsession with trees, and there was nothing on trees at all. And it just didn't seem to fit. And there was, in fact, huge resistance in Time Out to imagining that anything we did could be to do with nature. So can I have a slide, please, Paul? So luckily in 2009, I met Graham Simmons of the charity Trees for Cities, which is a fabulous charity that does exactly what it says. They plant trees in cities, and those, in their early days, they were called Trees for London, I think, but then they expanded out. And they were looking for a publisher for a book, because they were the first people who had, in London, created this list of great trees. And in fact, they'd started doing that. They started their charity in the early 1990s, I think. And they started with parties. They ran club nights, which was pretty ideal. They raised money from parties and planted trees. Their first avenue of trees was on Westminster Bridge Road, I think. Some Rowans. It'd be interesting to see if they're still there now. So that was in about 1993. So if I can, next slide, Paul. The thing that changed everything for them and for many, many people was in fact the Great Storm of 1987, which I'm sure you remember. It raged through London. I managed to sleep through the entire thing somehow, but it raged through London, and it was coming up for the 10-year anniversary of that Trees for Cities decided they wanted to create their list of great trees. So the Great Storm in a way was a catalyst. It was actually a catalyst for Roger Deakins' book as well, Wildwood, you may remember, the absolutely iconic book of woodland. It was only then that he and many, many other people realized how shallow the roots of trees were, which seems bizarre because surely we all knew this long before, but it made people focus on trees, the Great Storm. So although it wreaked devastation everywhere and millions of trees disappeared, it was actually, in a weird way, quite a good thing. So anyway, in 1997, they gathered together a committee, I suppose, of tree officers, the Evening Standard, the Mayor of London. They were heavily supported by a man called Boris Johnson at the time. And they came up with a list of 41 great trees. 41, a rather random number. Can I have the slide, Paul? But they had 3 criteria for choosing them. They had to have historical significance, was the first thing. This here is the Bexley Charter Oak. London stretches in their definition a long way out. This is the Bexley Charter Oak. There's nothing, that's a 200-odd-year-old oak, and it's a very beautiful thing. But there's nothing spectacular about it, other than, I suppose, its historical significance. The surprising thing about its historical significance is that it was only introduced in, I think, in 1937, when Bexley turned from a district council into a metropolitan borough. So it's not exactly up there with the Anquick Yew, and King John went nowhere near it. Paul, next slide please, the second of the 3 criteria was location. So the tree had to have a significant location. This is the Dorchester Plain. I think it's the Dorchester Plain. So I've got that off Google, but from my memory, it's not possibly the Dorchester Plain. It may be. Anyway, it says Dorchester very plainly there. It has to be in a landmark location or an interesting location, which this one qualified. And it is a beautiful plain, it's true. And then the third criteria, Paul, is its physical character. And I think this is the one which gave them more free rein, and people would just walk past a tree and go, what the bloody hell is that? This was in Batty Park, is the Batty Park strawberry tree. I get to Batty Park a bit, and I'm ashamed to say I haven't visited it for a long time, so I have no idea if it's still there, and perhaps someone will know, but let's hope it is. It's a beautiful tree with a lot of character. So 10 years after this first list was created, I got involved with Time Out, persuaded them to do this book. Slide, Paul, thank you. This beautiful book was the result, which is 60 great trees of London. The writer and editor of it was a tireless woman called Jenny Landreth, who in her very heartfelt introduction wrote, "In researching this book, I discovered parts of London that were a complete mystery, parts of London I never thought I'd see, and parts of London I know I will never see again." And the subtext, I think, was never wanted to see again. She traipsed around the whole of London and visited all the trees. And it turned out actually that some of the trees nominated by the tree officers and Trees for Cities didn't actually exist and possibly never existed. Could I have the next slide, Paul, which got me thinking that one day we could create a book of imaginary or fictional trees, because there have been so many significant trees in our lives that have never existed. The magic faraway tree of Enid Blyton, that is, that sinister thing there, which you can perhaps half see, is an Ent from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, of course. Anyway, the truest thing that Jenny wrote in the book was this: one of the benefits of writing this book is a new habit. Wherever I go, I'm constantly looking up at the size, shape, and type of tree I can see in passing. And it's absolutely true. Jenny, when she started the book, had an interest in trees, but it became a lifelong obsession. And it's true with so many of us that our obsessions grow over the years. I know we're going to be talking quite a lot about what makes a great tree. And I think Simon's already said this very nicely, that one of the things is that it's very, very personal. So what I look for is a particular kind of magic. a presence, a communion even. Could I have the next slide, please, Paul? There are some trees that speak to us more than others. Some speak to us in general, and some trees are just very, very personal. This is my favourite tree. It's on Wandsworth Common, and when I was writing my book, Oak and Ash and Thorn, I visited this tree every single day and stood under it and bathed in its inspiration and magic. And sometimes I would bring myself to hug it, even though Wandsworth Common is a very crowded common, and you get some sharp looks from the dog walkers. They see you lurking next to a tree. There's nothing especially special about it. I don't know how old it was, but sadly it died in the last drought about 18 months ago. I think the nice thing about it is that sort of weird little shape you can see, and in fact you can look through the middle of it. But it's a magical tree, and I'm sure it inspired me when I was writing my book. Anyway, it's died sadly, and I'm now looking for a new great tree of London, but I've decided not to rush it, but I know somewhere in my local parks and commons it's out there. So there are many ways of defining great trees. I want to add the fact that it can be very personal, it can be very magic, but there are also some serious criteria that we could look at, and I'm looking forward to discussing them. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Peter. That was really interesting. And I can report that last summer I went to visit the strawberry tree in Batty Park, and it was doing just fine. Rather overgrown, but still there and very healthy.
It's a lovely tree.
It is, yeah. So just before we move on to Margaret, I just wanted to, I think we forgot to say this at the beginning, but please do, if you have questions for the panelists, we'll be asking them to answer them at the end of the session. So if you have them, please put them into the Q&A, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom window, and you can see those, and you can also upvote them if there are some which you particularly like or you have the same question. So I'll hand over to Margaret now, who will take it from here. Thank you.
I'm going to be speaking about the Vernon Road oak. I think it's a sort of an every tree. Is the Vernon oak a great tree? After all, it's not exceptionally ancient, nor exceptionally rare, nor exceptionally beautiful. But it has been described as a very fine specimen, and there's no doubt it's a magnificent and healthy oak tree. It's the only street tree on the road where I live in Sheffield. And in 2015, Sheffield City Council decided that this tree, which was one of thousands selected, there were potentially up to 17,500, it must be felled as part of the Streets Ahead programme. This was a multi-million-pound upgrade of the city's streets. Even Michael Gove was moved to say at one point in the events, bonkers. And that's when people started to take notice of the street trees in the city and imagine what it might be like without them. And we started to imagine what it would be like without Vernon. It's thought that most of Sheffield's street trees were planted within the last 100 to 120 years, but Vernon is about 150 years old and first sprouted at the edge of what was then a Derbyshire field. Next slide, please. The road is about 95 years old, so it would have already been well grown when the street was built. In the slide, there's a little arrow pointing to Vernon. Those early days, growing at the edge of a Derbyshire field, must have helped it to become well established, because it still thrives in spite of being crowded now by the houses, the road and the pavement. The felling notice appeared on the tree. The reason was damage to surface. That meant there was a bit of uplift on the pavement and a buttress root was slightly protruding onto the road. And by early 2016, the residents were questioning this decision and resisting it. Soon there were posters in all the windows saying, "Let's save the Vernon oak," and the campaign had begun. But at this stage, Vernon was without its own voice. And then Vernon joined Twitter. Vernon became a model of active citizenship. That must be an attribute of greatness, I think. And it began campaigning for the street trees in Sheffield through its Twitter account. And it made friends throughout the world. People and politicians of all parties made pilgrimages to visit Vernon. And I think Simon referred to visiting trees as an attribute of greatness. It provoked an explosion of creativity, artwork, poems, messages were attached to the trunk. Slide, please. And people gathered to sing their support for Vernon. It was obvious to the tree campaigners from the very beginning that people had strong emotional connections to the trees. The trees held memories for long-standing residents and reminded people of the Derbyshire field where it had once grown. It was beautiful, inspiring, consoling, and alive with life. Another great Sheffield tree is the Chelsea Rolled Elm, which boasts a colony of white letter streak butterflies. Slide, please. Oh, I think we're a bit behind on the slides. Yeah, and the next one. Oh, that's it. That's the Chelsea Road Elm there. As the police and security guards became increasingly involved, next slide, the campaign intensified. And our quiet suburban streets were filled with police vehicles, officers and security guards, as well as journalists and TV cameras. It was brutal. It reached a peak when it was Vernon's turn to be felled. Early on the felling day, as the Sahara sun of October 2017 turned the sky orange, a mystery climber appeared in the canopy. Next slide, please. Later, he told the TV journalist that he was prepared to stay up there all week if necessary. And the media descended on the road, regional, national, and even international. Vernon's team set up camp, determined at all costs to protect the tree. Benjamin Zephaniah tweeted his support, "My heart's with those that walk the streets and the great old Vernon oak." Vernon Kay waved a branch about and urged that his namesake be spared. After some days of high drama, the threat receded, thanks to an offer from the charity Trees for City. The offer was never taken up by Streets Ahead, and the campaign continued amid protests and felling across Sheffield until it was paused in March 2018. After mediated talks chaired by the Bishop of Sheffield and heroic efforts by the Sheffield Tree Action Group, a partnership Sheffield Street Tree Working Strategy was finally published in March 2020. Vernon has been reprieved and quiet has returned to the road. Now, Vernon may be an every tree, an ordinary street tree, but what an extraordinarily inspiring one. Vernon's turned residents into activists, keyboard warriors, and social media geeks. It's inspired songs, celebrations, walks thanks to TiCL, poetry, art, and a much greater awareness of the natural world. Thanks to Vernon and the dedicated team, all Sheffield schools and libraries have a copy of The Lost Words by Robert Macfarlane and Jackie Morris. Thanks to Vernon, new connections and friends have been made. Thanks to Vernon, trees have been grown and planted. Little Vernons are growing all over the country. Thanks to Vernon, we have Robert Macfarlane's Heartwood. Oh, the Heartwood slide, please. And the accompanying artwork by Jackie Morris and Nick Hayes. This was written as a charm against harm for all trees threatened with unjust felling. Thanks to Vernon, we had a wonderful street tree festival in September 2018 to celebrate the city's trees and the lessons we had learnt during the campaign. Although he's leading a quieter life now, Vernon is still active in the community and was even happy to hold the bunting on VE Day. It's easy to take the ordinary, everyday things for granted. But as we've just come to realise, it's those things that we yearn for when it seems they may be taken away. Does it always take a threatened disaster for us to realise that the ordinary can be extraordinary and we should value it as such? So, is Vernon a great tree? Definitely. Thanks.
Great, that was fantastic, Margaret. That was really, really interesting.
Sorry, my slides were slightly out of sync.
Oh, that's okay. I think we got through them, and I think hopefully everybody understood and it didn't interrupt everybody's attention there. So I want to see whether we've got any questions coming in. So please do put your questions into the Q&A if you have any. There is one from Sian, and she's asking, where can she find detailed information about Richmond's trees? So I might hand this one over to Simon, who's probably best placed to do that. So you might need to unmute yourself, Simon.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, thanks for that, Paul. I saw that question come in, look, my experience of the parks is that Royal Parks Foundation have some lovely resources about the trees they have there, and I think that would be the first place to go. The second people I would go to, friends groups, and I know Richmond Parks have a very active, there's a Friends of Richmond Park, and I definitely would be inclined to get in touch with them. I'm biased. I always go to a friends group because they always seem to know of green spaces. They always seem to know about trees, but I know they would be able to help. So those would be the two places specifically for Richmond Park that I'd direct people to.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm not sure whether if anybody else would have anything to add to that, but if you do you want to chuck it in if there's any more that you could say about trees in Richmond Park? But maybe that's a little bit local. But maybe it does bring up the question of how do people become aware of trees that are become great? And I was wondering if, as Margaret was saying about how the threatened destruction of trees in Sheffield caused trees to become aware of them. I'm obviously aware of Vernon Oak. I'm also aware of Duchess Lime, sadly no longer, and the Chelsea Road Elm as well. And I wonder if there's that awareness of trees is something which where does that exist, I suppose? Does it need to be written down? Does it exist in social media? Does it exist on the internet? Or is it something which has to have more of a permanent legacy? Is it something that has to be awarded, perhaps? And maybe that's a question for you, Margaret. Thinking about Sheffield and the trees in Sheffield in particular.
I think Peter alluded to the fact that it was the loss of the trees that started him thinking about the trees for his book, and I think it's when things are threatened and when you risk losing the trees that you see every day that I think people are galvanized into action. The street trees are exceptionally important. I think a lot of people have realized in this lockdown period that nearby nature is absolutely crucial to our well-being. For some people who habitually can't get out, who are confined to home, who are caring, seeing a tree in spring is a fantastic experience. And it should be something which local authorities fight hard to preserve. In Sheffield, it was easy, well, not easy, but it was understandable when individual families or people perhaps were less sympathetic to the trees. You know, everybody wants to make their own lives easier in the ways that they can. But what we need are tree officers and local authorities to speak up for everybody else and to look after the trees on behalf of the whole community.
Yeah. And I was also wondering if, Peter, you might have some comments about whether there was a noticeable sort of response to the Great Trees of London book, and whether that raised awareness of those trees, and whether what the impact of that book was, because I know it sold pretty well. I think it's out of print now, but
badly. It sold really well, and you know, it's hard to know anecdotally, but of course I got lots of comments myself saying what a marvelous book. But as you do as an author, if you're lucky. But no, it's. I think it did provoke something, but it was sort of riding a wave. There's been a interest in trees has been rising for quite a while now, and that sort of coincided with it. I think the Great Storm, I've only realised recently, had a huge impact on so many people. The way it devastated hillsides of trees, entire woods were felled, often conifer plantations, because they were not built to withstand such high winds, and the fact that people could then see their roots and all sorts of reasons. People became more interested in trees because of that. Roger Deakin's book I've mentioned, Thomas Pakenham's Meetings with Remarkable Trees, I think had a big influence. I think he photographs 2 Richmond trees in that book. It's a lovely, huge photographic book of his encounters with trees, which sort of personalized it as well. Every single photograph he takes, which is a beautiful thing, has got someone standing next to the tree just to give it a sense of scale. But I think what it's done inadvertently by doing that is reminded us, you know, it's all about our relationship with trees. People, you know, are often quite shy to talk about their relationship with trees. And I think they're less shy these days, but nonetheless, the more, you know, doesn't matter how many people you talk to, almost everyone will have some kind of feeling for trees, or have noticed a particular tree, even when it was only when they were a child that had been clambering over a fallen tree or whatever. But, you know, trees are an emotional subject for people as well as something to be studied and understood. And yes, also the amount of interest in trees sort of seems to double every year as you know, books come out, for example, about how trees communicate with one another. That was a huge thing through their underground networks of fungi. It goes on, doesn't it? I know that to go back to what Margaret was saying, you know, in Tooting, near where I live, there was an avenue of horse chestnuts felled, I think probably 18 months ago or something, and that was another example. It's a Joni Mitchell moment. They paved paradise and put up a parking lot. You only really notice what's there once it's gone. And I think it's sad but true. So I think one of the good things about the book and about the idea of great trees generally is plaques, memorials, to get people talking about them. Because even if you can just attach something to them and make people sort of stop and pause and look and see, oh, why has that got something on it, that helps bring people's attention to it.
That brings me back to, in fact, it's there's some questions beginning to come in now. So the top one from Anita is about the Heartwood poster, and I think I might have noticed you get the Heartwood charm, Margaret, as well.
I did,
which is
yes.
Similar to what Peter was talking about in terms of putting a plaque on them, and I know Simon was mentioning that in his presentation. So is that something that people can get hold of, or is that a very special object that is only able to be
given to great
honoured?
trees?
Yes.
No. Well, these little charms, this is Jackie Morris's artwork. Jackie Morris, who wrote The Lost Words with Robert Macfarlane. So this is how she rendered Heartwood. And Sue Unwin, one of Vernon's team, one of the campaigners, she made these little charms, and I think she does still produce them, and I do believe they are sent out to trees who are experiencing difficulties. The Heartwood slide that we showed, that was Nick Hayes's work, and we did do a limited run of those. I think if people are interested in those, probably the best way to do that, to express their interest, would be to DM Vernon on Twitter.
Great. Oh, well, thank you. So if anybody's interested, you've heard it there. That's at Save Door Trees, I believe.
Yes, that's right.
And hopefully Erica might be able to put that in the chat if anybody's interested. And sort of moving on a bit from that, there's a couple of questions which are getting a lot of interest in the Q&A panel. And Mel is asking about the concern, really, that if trees become great, they attract tourists, and therefore we get a lot of activity around them, can cause damage to roots and so on, and the tree's health. And I was wondering whether any of you wanted to say anything about this particularly.
I would say yes, there is obviously concern about root damage. You know, if people were flocking to these trees perhaps and climbing them, etc. But I wonder what sort of whether we're likely to be causing more damage to people by protecting them from the trees, reducing interest in trees by keeping them secret and hidden. And I think there is a balance to be had there. Certainly the trees that have made the most impression on me are the ones I climbed as a boy, but I went inside, you know, great oaks that were split open. And I just think, you know, those trees now, the great oak, for example, in Richmond Park, funnily enough, one of my favourites, you know, is fenced off now for its protection. But I think perhaps to our ill health.
I suppose that would be something that would be difficult to happen to Vernon, to fence Vernon off, who must already be subject to a lot of sort of damage, perhaps from vehicles and people using the path and so on.
True. I mean, the tarmac is virtually up to the trunk, so it's difficult to think of how much more damage a tourist would make. But he certainly had a lot of tourists, you know, Taiwan, the Netherlands, quite extraordinary. And to go back to what I think Peter was saying about the emotional connection, people are emotionally connected. Somehow they do have persona. The trees do have a personality. It sounds strange, but it's true.
Yeah, I completely concur. I know that myself. I don't know. Would you have any comments on that, Peter? Or?
Yeah, no. Of course, trees have personalities, and it's in another era we would have just taken that for granted. But obviously, we've become so divorced from the woods, the forest, nature in general, that we find it strange that it should be talking to us or communicating with us in a way that sometimes we try and communicate with it. And, you know, of course, people might imagine we're just imposing cultural ideas on things or seeing things that are not there. And these things are not really very easy to pin down in a precise or scientific way. But it's there, you know, if enough people feel it to know it. And I firmly believe, I walk past a silver birch that's right by the front of my house every day I leave, and only recently I just suddenly stopped to do something underneath it and then became aware of its presence in a way I hadn't noticed before. I think you just have to pause a bit rather than rush everywhere. And you mentioned lockdown, Margaret. This is interesting as to whether it has opened people's eyes a bit more to what is immediately around them, particularly the street trees. There's so many amazing street trees in most of our cities. And has it opened people's eyes to it? I think so, but will it be a long-lasting thing is very different and perhaps a difficult point, because as soon as we are unlocked down, obviously government advisors have already unlocked themselves down without any permission. But as soon as the rest of us are allowed to go out, we might find we're just rushing around as normal.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So going back to the panel with a Q&A, Nicola, who I know is in Toronto, is suggesting that great trees could go global.
Yes.
And I know Peter, I know Simon would be jumping at that possibility, but I suppose is great trees, I suppose that sort of asks the question, is it peculiarly British thing? Is it something which would be something which translates in the rest of the world? I know we're all speaking from our point of view, our sort of very British perspective on this, but I suppose the concept seems to be quite a basic human sort of emotional context, perhaps. I don't know whether anybody's got any thoughts on how it might go global. Simon, you're chomping at the bit.
I'm chomping at the bit. I'm chomping at the bit. It's absolutely innate in humans to love trees and to look after the stuff around them. Nicola, go for it. Start creating your great trees. Start local. Start with the trees. Ask people about them. You find fantastic things on your doorstep. Open it up to the world. Okay, go for it right now.
Paul, if I can just chip in here, just looking at the chat panel, Marco has posted a link to information about trees in Peru.
Oh, fantastic!
Marvelous.
And make that available to people.
Yeah, well, that's amazing, and it's great to have people from all over the world on the chat on this Zoom as well. So great to get these perspectives from around the world. So I think the next question is sort of maybe going back towards Sheffield again. In fact, there's a couple here. There's Rob McBride, the tree hunter.
Yes, great friend.
Yeah, and Ross are both asking about groups and sort of how do trees sort of become great, I suppose. I'm trying to just sort of try and weave these into one question, I suppose, but Rob's asking, there are 25 contender trees in Sheffield for greatness, and do people regard them as such? And Ross is talking about great trees being created for the future. So who is ensuring the planting of trees in an appropriate medium and maintaining them over the next few hundred years? So I suppose the question is, how do we ensure that great trees will be there for future generations? Is it on us? Is it part of our duty to create a great tree by planting it and saying this will be a great tree? Or do great trees just come about through things which happen to them and the fortunes of time and so on to allow them, and other fortunes, as what's happened in Sheffield shows, perhaps, that circumstances have thrust Vernon into greatness rather than greatness being thrust upon him? I don't know. Any thoughts on that from the panel?
Well, I do think that there are hundreds of great trees in Sheffield. You mentioned Duchess, just on the neighbouring road, the Chelsea Road Elm, the Rustlings Road trees. You know, when the campaign started, everybody started saying, yes, we've got hundreds of great trees in Sheffield. And as far as the other parts of the question about the future, I am slightly worried because so many of the trees that are planted these days are relatively short-lived trees. You know, will there be another Vernon Oak?
Yes, it's down to what the planting mix is, isn't it? And it's worth mentioning tree officers here, because I had no idea there was such a thing as tree officers until a couple of years ago, really. And they do tireless work, planting trees, looking after the trees once they're planted, protecting them. And they decide often what the mix of planting should be, I believe. And certainly in London, we plant, as well as the London plane, which Paul will know more than me, but it's mildly out of fashion. But it's a pretty long-lived tree. But oaks get planted beech trees very rarely, but the longer lived trees do get planted. But you're right, sometimes the trees are just planted in a utilitarian way. They grow fast and they're expected to last for 40, 50 years, and then they're pulled down and another one popped in their place. And that's not the way to create not only things of beauty and personality, but also things that bring real environmental benefits and a proper canopy. Because a little diddly tree that's shooting up, as you protested about so well, Margaret, is not the same as a tree that stood there with its vast canopy for 200 years, leaching out the toxins and pumping out the oxygen.
Exactly.
And if I can add, just in terms of looking after trees, yes, a definite positive for tree officers and the Tree Officer Association. I would direct people to. So we have a council officers looking after trees, tree wardens as well locally. There are groups of tree wardens under the Tree Council scheme who look after trees, and we're very encouraging of people to adopt trees, particularly this time of year. It's terribly easy for newly planted trees to die without enough water, and to create the future great trees, we're going to have to start looking after our local environment. And I would say, to create a great tree of the future, go out and water one outside your door, do you know? And there's just a small chance then we'll have some great trees in the future. Okay.
Great.
I think it's really interesting that Vernon Oak was there before the street. So
Yes,
yes. That photograph showing the road being built is fascinating, isn't it?
Yes.
As Vernon says in one of the interviews, really the road should be Quercus Robur Road rather than poor Vernon having to be named after the road.
You're absolutely right. Trees were here first.
Yeah,
absolutely. Even in the plaques of the great trees, the organisations behind the plaque, even in the last 10 years, don't exist anymore or have changed form. And the tree continues getting better and better, and it's sort of gently leaving us behind and getting greater. I find that fantastic.
I suppose that at some point in its life, as we lose interest in trees, if we do, then the notion of a great tree might disappear, only for a future generation to rediscover it. So it's a sort of cyclical human thing. We're kind of getting to the end now. So I just want to pull out a couple of other questions, really. So one of which, and I'm sort of looking for fairly short answers, is are there any, and this is from an anonymous attendee, any ideas about how we can measure the emotional value of trees?
Oh, I bet there's a psychology postgraduate somewhere working on that.
Yeah. They need to pin electrodes on people and as they stand under trees. But no, it was really interesting during the Sheffield campaign how the caveat value, trying to attach financial value to trees, went ahead, which is a real mixed response, because I think it was helpful to help the accountants see that trees had value, but it also misses the point about what value is.
I also think actually, you can get with them, systems where you can leave comments and leave your thoughts at a tree. Okay, if they're positive comments, that I think that creates some evidence of how somebody is feeling at that tree. Yeah. And I would also say that actually the physical visiting the tree is good for you. Okay, but even if it's just the walk. The walk and the discovery, and so there's a physical and mental health proven if you go and leave a positive comment at a tree.
And Greg Packman, who I know is a tree officer, points out that an aspect of greatness is their impact and legacy, and I think that's very true. And it's great to have a tree officer among the attendees as well. Yeah. So I think we're really close to having to wrap up. So I think the very final question is, name your great tree. So I think, Margaret, that's an easy one.
Certainly is, yes.
Yeah.
It would have to be Vernon Oak, if nothing else, because it has made us connect with so many other people and places, experts, trees. It's a model for greatness.
Great. Yes, thank you. Peter, do you have
Well, I've already said, sadly, I've lost my great tree, and it's too early for me to move on. Although I'm feeling very warmly disposed to Vernon Oak right now, so but I know she's too far away. So,
2 votes for Vernon.
The search goes on.
Simon.
I can't abandon the Royal Oak in Richmond Park. Too much tied up in my life to let it go. But it's a tragic question because they're all wonderful, obviously, and Vernon's got a special place in my heart too.
Great. Well, I can just answer Alina's question, which was, what's the tree behind in my background? And it's my great tree, and it's an almond tree in Finsbury Park, and it has this amazing twisted trunk and blossoms in January, and is a local landmark. So that's mine. And I'll ask Neil as well if he's got a great tree, perhaps being on the panel as an honour as the CPRE director and the person organising all these webinars.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks everyone for a fantastic session. Yeah, one of my many favourite trees is the venerable old elm, surviving elm that down in my hometown in Brighton. There are 2 elms, several centuries old, on the edge of Preston Park. Sadly, one of them, it seems, has succumbed to the dreaded disease, but the other one is thriving wonderfully. And it's a bit of a shout out also to Vivian Barton, who I know has joined us and has done a fantastic project on the great trees of Brighton as well. So that's wonderful.
I'm sorry we didn't get round to answering your question, Vivian, but I guess that about wraps it up. And thank you all very much for attending the last Tree Rings webinar, the penultimate event of the entire Urban Tree Festival. I hope you've enjoyed it so far, and do join the next one at 4 o'clock, which is Write About Trees. So thank you to the panelists as well for your illuminating answers, which were fantastic, in your presentations. And thank you everybody for coming.
If anyone's interested in the work of CPRE London, there's a few links posted in the chat bar. And I also don't want the occasion to pass without a reference to the wonderful Alan Mitchell, a great dendrologist who sadly passed away a number of years ago, and who did so much work almost single-handedly to record personally many of the great trees of Britain. Do check out his work. There's a link in the chat bar. Thanks everybody, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.